Hello guys, it's me. It was my first real video, since, the channel's all about tanks basically, so I thought I'd start off with the first real tanks, which are the Marks 1, 2, and 3, used during World War I, from really designed in late 1915, but basically used from 1916 onwards. They were the start of what's basically called the British Landship. You can see here, so we'll just be starting off with the Mark 1, obviously. Technically, this isn't the first tank. That would be the Little Willie and Big Willie and #1 Lincoln machine, which they'll also get a video for themselves. They deserve their own video, which I'll give them. But for now, I'm just gonna talk about these three. So with Mark 1, let's just start off with the crew. There was a crew of 8 people in this tank: the commander, the driver, 2 men in charge of changing gears, and 4 gunners. There are 2 variants for the tank. There's the male variant, back when we used to assume tank genders, that weighed 28 tons and were armed with 2 6-pounder Hotchkiss guns and 3 .303 Hotchkiss machine guns. The 6-pounder Hotchkiss guns would be later replaced, but for the Mark 1 they did the job. Then the female variants were initially produced mainly because there's a lack of the 6-pounder Hotchkiss guns in England. So instead they were given a total of 4 Hotchkiss machine guns and 1 Vickers gun. Though the female tank idea would exist throughout the entire period of World War I, and it would continue after World War I up until the end of the Second World War in the form of tankettes. Originally they were introduced here with the Mark 1 though. The tanks were really slow and bulky, as you can see here. They had an average speed of 4 miles an hour, though theoretically they could reach a top speed of 5, but because of the, bumpy, hole-filled nature, and, there's mud everywhere, no man's land, they never really could go 5 miles an hour. They had an effective operational distance of at least 15 miles, and depending on if they were brand new or if they were worn down, they could go up to 24 miles. Most tanks were expected to last 6 hours of combat before engine failure, which was the cause of the majority of tank casualties, or destruction. We'll talk about armor later, but destruction was pretty common for these tanks. The early designs, as you can see in this picture here, up on the upper left, were given wooden steering wheels in the back to hopefully assist with the steering, since it wasn't very good. However, they broke way too easily and were prone to just not doing their job as well as they should have, so they were scrapped with later models. Wire mesh nets were also implemented a lot. Basically, they just protected the tank from grenades, which worked in varied levels of success, honestly, and even later models like the Mark IV occasionally used wire mesh nets if the situation called for it, but they weren't really on every single tank. The armor was not very good. The lowest was 6 millimeters, and the highest was 12 millimeters. It could withstand basic rifle ammunition and machine gun rounds. However, even specialized reverse bullets, also known as K bullets, which were specialized larger bullets used in bolt-action rifles, could punch through them pretty easily if they were hit at a straight angle. Armor-piercing rounds found in German machine guns were also very tough obstacles for these first 3 models, and even occasionally later models. The Mark 1 initially, 100 orders were placed in 1916 by the British Army, but that was up to have an additional 50 placed, so they could make 6 tank regiments with 25 tanks each. These were originally codenamed heavy machine gun regiments, but once the truth got out, they were just renamed to tank regiments. A pretty major variant of the Mark 1 was the gun carrier Mark 1. There were 48 gun carrier Mark 1s built, and they could either carry a 6-inch howitzer, which could be fired while moving, though the recoil could do not very good things to the tank. But this technically made the first self-propelled gun in history, which we'd see time and time again being created. Or it could have a 60-pounder gun, which you needed to stop to actually fire and required a bunch of crewmen. Depending on the gun, it carried a weight of 27 to 55 tons, which not only caused it to be extremely slow at 3 miles an hour, even worse than the normal Mark 1, but it was very prone to engine failure due to the weight being meh. It only needed a 4-man crew because it didn't have any guns on it other than the actual artillery. But the artillery pieces also required an additional 4 to 8 men. So either it had a normal 8-man crew or it had even more. The artillery pieces were also occasionally removed later in the war when these weren't really needed as often. And the gun carrier was just used to transfer supplies, which it was actually pretty good at. And as you can see here, like I said, the gun carrier Mark 1, the normal Mark 1 tank, and the later Mark 2 tank were converted into supply carriers. You can see above here, that's a picture of one, and to the right is a little diagram. You can see the comparison from the normal gun carrier Mark 1 to the actual supply version. Several Mark 1 female tanks were also used as mobile wireless radio stations, but they had to stop moving to communicate and had a very large antenna built, which was susceptible to getting hit by enemies, artillery shrapnel, and even if the wind was very bad, it could take down the tower. But it did its job mostly, and it was a good usage for these pretty outdated tanks. Next up we have the Mark II, which it was designed and created as a training tank only, because the British Army knew they were going to produce many more tanks later, because even when the Mark II was built, the Mark IV, which would come much later on, was initially expected to be an improvement, but it just couldn't be built, designed, produced fast enough, so the Mark IIs and III were produced. But these were just built as training tanks. Its armor was even supposedly made of unhardened steel, though that's pretty debatable. It would see combat, as we'll soon talk about, but it was not designed to ever. It was just made as training tanks. There were 50 Mark IIs produced, 25 males and 25 females. 25 stayed in the United Kingdom to use in training, and 5 were kept there as testing as well. 20 were sent to France because they just really needed tanks, honestly. But the 25 training tanks that were kept in England were sent to France eventually anyways to join 20 other Mark IIs and 15 Mark Is at the Battle of Arras, where the previously mentioned shitty Mark I and Mark II armor was very susceptible to armor-piercing rounds, which allowed the Germans to put up an excellent fight against the massive beasts. The 5 Mark IIs that were actually kept in England were put up against the Mother tank, which, like I said, will be its own video, in trials, who was given the better engine to actually compete. The Mark IIs tested an improved epicyclic gear systems, which basically they destroyed the Mother in trials. However, the system wouldn't actually be implemented until the Mark V, which will not be talked about in this video. This caused future British Landships after the Mark V, if they were to be produced, to use this improved gear system, which caused less crewmen to be needed overall, more guns to be placed, and it just made the inside ergonomics better in general. Next up we have the Mark III British tanks, which were designed to be training tanks, just like the Mark IIs. But unlike the Mark IIs, the Mark IIIs actually remained training tanks and never saw combat. They were produced as just a stopgap measure to train crews for the upcoming waves of tanks needed in the future models, mainly the Mark IV. The females were given smaller responses than usual and just Lewis guns to train with. Only 50 were built, and the last 2 were scrapped and melted down during World War II, and I don't think any remain today. So final assessments for all these 3. The Mark I was the first real tank because it was the first tank used to shoot at people, so in my opinion that makes it the first tank. They really pioneered the technology in general. It began the Allies' push through the trenches of the Western Front, which had been a stalemate for 2 years, and inflicted massive casualties. And while these designs were impressive at the time, they had numerous flaws. There were a lot of changes intended for the Mark I from the beginning: a better gun, better engine, better layout, that was basically ignored until the Mark IV came around and actually implemented them due to just the need for tanks to fight with and tanks to train with in general. And the engine caused a bunch of cases of CO2 poisoning for the crew, which made the crew have to leave the tank literally in the middle of the battle and just throw up on the ground, which obviously wasn't good. Most of the tank losses were literally just tied to the tanks getting stuck in artillery holes or mud. They could cause trenches, but if they got stuck, it was very hard to take them out, especially if a track was damaged. Or the engine would just break down after a while. Like I said, it was expected to run for 6 hours, but I mean, after that, who knew? Communication was a major issue as well, with basically flag bearers and carrier pigeons being used, and they weren't effective enough for large-scale planning and the operations that these Landships were made for. These problems did plague most tanks of the First World War in general, but they were most prevalent in these first 3 models. But the tanks did change the course of the First World War and all wars that would come after it, so I think they deserve respect for just for that. But that's gonna end this video on the first 3 tanks. Next up, I'm gonna basically have a video on the Mark IV and Mark V, and then all the planned Landships after that. And then after that video, I think I'll go back and talk about the #1 Lincoln machine, the Little Willie, and the Big Willie tanks, because I think they're worth talking about. But yeah, hope you enjoyed the video, and this is, the Tank Index out. Peace.